Good morning, everybody. Just like to talk a little bit about ResApp Health today. So ResApp Health is an ASX listed company. We've been listed on the market for roughly 4 years now. Our focus is developing digital diagnostic tests using a smartphone to diagnose respiratory disease. So essentially what we do is we turn the smartphone that is in your pocket into a true medical device, able to accurately diagnose respiratory diseases such as pneumonia or asthma using the sound of your cough. And I'll get to how the technology works a little bit later. So as I said, our target is developing what will be the world's first regulatory approved, clinically validated digital diagnostic test for respiratory disease. Respiratory disease is the most common reason for someone to go to a doctor. There are roughly 700 million visits every year where someone goes to the doctor and gets diagnosed with respiratory disease. Our focus over the last 4 years has been really on developing the clinical evidence through clinical trials to demonstrate that our app, our software, is able to accurately diagnose these diseases just as accurately as a clinician in a major hospital with access to chest x-rays, blood tests, the whole suite of tests that are being used. We have now completed 3 pivotal prospective double-blind clinical studies that demonstrate the clinical usefulness of our technology, and the data from those studies have been submitted to regulatory agencies in Europe and the US, and will also be submitted to Australia shortly. We're well funded, we're ASX listed, we have just over $5 million in the bank, which takes us all the way through to commercialization. We have broadened what we can do since founding the company 4 years ago. We're able to now not just look at acute diagnosis of respiratory disease, we're looking at management of diseases such as COPD and asthma, we're looking at obstructive sleep apnea, we're working with Lockheed Martin and the US Defense Department on monitoring troops, and we're also developing hardware and wearable devices to complement our smartphone-based solutions. So a little bit about the company. We have a market cap today of about 120 million. We're listed on the ASX, and we have a cash balance of just over 5 million. As I said, diagnosis of respiratory disease is the most common outcome from someone visiting a general practitioner or a primary care doctor. It's also one of the most common reasons for hospital admission for diseases such as bronchiolitis in children or asthma and COPD in adults. Respiratory disease can typically be broken down into 2 types. One is an upper respiratory disease, which affects the upper respiratory tract, and then you go to lower respiratory tract diseases, which are more severe, which is essentially affecting the lungs. Each of these different diseases are treated in a very different way, so it's really important that you get the diagnosis correct so that you can, for example, give antibiotics to patients who have pneumonia or steroids to patients who have asthma. The problem today is that it's diagnosed with a stethoscope, with chest x-ray, with imaging, with spirometry, with blood tests, basically with a whole suite of tests. This suite of tests is expensive, it's time consuming, and in the end it's actually not that accurate. Estimates for clinician accuracy for diagnosing these diseases range anywhere between 50 to 70%. So these are difficult diseases to diagnose. Our technology uses machine learning technology that was originally developed at the University of Queensland. That technology essentially listens to cough sounds, looks for signatures in cough sounds, and matches those signatures to disease. An analogy you can think of is the way Shazam listens to music and gives you an artist and a song title. We use very similar algorithms underlying to listen to cough sounds, look for signatures that are associated with particular diseases such as pneumonia or asthma. So essentially we hold the phone, a standard off-the-shelf iPhone or Samsung phone, an arm's length away from the patient. We ask the patient to cough 5 times. We record those cough sounds. We ignore background noise. And we then ask a few questions about the patient, about their date of birth, how old they are, whether they're male or female. And then finally we provide a diagnosis. So all of this analysis is done on the phone. There's no cloud-based server here. It's all done on the phone, and it's all done through the cough sound. So we have taken this technology now to 3 major pivotal clinical studies, 2 in pediatrics, 1 in adults. So those 2 pediatric studies, one was in Australia, one was in the US. Our Australian study was recently published in a peer-reviewed medical journal, Respiratory Research, and the data from that study, which showed that our technology was between 80 and 97% accurate for diagnosing different childhood respiratory diseases, that data has been submitted to European regulators for approval in Europe. A US clinical study was a large clinical study run at three very prestigious US hospitals, including Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston and the Cleveland Clinic. Here we got results in the high 70s, essentially, for accuracy, a little bit lower than what we saw in Australia. And what we saw was differences in US clinical practice in the US compared to what we saw in Australia. And we actually saw even higher rates of disagreement between clinicians in their diagnosis of these diseases. So essentially there's more scatter in the US diagnosis. These results were also presented recently at the American Thoracic Society, the leading society for respiratory medicine in the US, and this data was also submitted to the FDA in April this year. So we now have a CE mark submission underway, we have an FDA mark submission underway, which we expect outcomes from very shortly. We recently published results for our adults clinical study in Australia, and again we're getting high 90% accuracy for diagnosing the majority of adult respiratory diseases, including importantly things like COPD exacerbations and asthma exacerbations. So this data we will then use to augment essentially our child CE submission to expand the use into adults. So how do we get this to market? So we have some great technology here. The question is, what's our strategy for commercializing? And our strategy revolves around telehealth. And so in telehealth, patients see a doctor over a video link, and it's a very common way of now seeing a primary care doctor or a GP in the US. The issue with telehealth is that that doctor no longer has the ability to use a stethoscope to listen to your chest, which is the first sort of cut that a clinician makes when diagnosing respiratory disease. So our key advantage here is we can provide that doctor with a very accurate way to remotely diagnose a patient through that telehealth consultation. Our business model here is partnering with those telehealth companies, so we end up being a B2B relationship with telehealth companies to immediately access their millions of customers who are using telehealth today, and we will charge every time our test is used. So I started talking about respiratory diagnosis, and that's really where the focus of the company has been for the last 3 or 4 years. But we've also expanded our platform into chronic disease management, such as COPD and asthma, as well as into other indications such as sleep apnea. And those are at different stages in our portfolio, many of which are in pivotal studies right now and regulatory submissions within 6 to 12 months. Chronic disease management, especially something like COPD, which is now the second largest cause of death in the world, is very important. We see that as a very big opportunity to be able to measure the severity of these diseases using something that somebody already has in their pocket, their smartphone. And so we've got some very early results, or some early results for COPD and asthma exacerbation, and we're looking to further develop these products so that we can provide digital therapeutics and digital tests, digital management tools for people with these diseases. So sleep apnea is another respiratory disease. Sleep apnea is one of those diseases where many people have it, but not many people know that they have it. And it's not just someone who is snoring. This is someone who actually stops breathing 10, 15, 20, 100 times every hour, every night. And what studies have found is that there are roughly 3 in 10 men, 2 in 10 women who suffer from sleep apnea, and 80% of those people don't know that they have sleep apnea. So when you have sleep apnea and you don't know it, you're undiagnosed, you're untreated, you have a significantly higher risk of heart disease, stroke, type 2 diabetes. It's a significant health risk. And the major reason why you don't know that you have sleep apnea is to get diagnosed with sleep apnea, you have to get hooked up with 12 wires and go and sleep the night in a very uncomfortable bed in a hospital to be diagnosed. Our solution is simply replace all those wires by a smartphone sitting on the bedside table that's able to accurately diagnose sleep apnea just as well as that polysomnography, as that full sleep test with all those wires. So you can imagine going to bed at night, putting the phone on the bedside table, pressing start, waking up the next morning and getting a clinically valid indication of sleep apnea on the phone. So just in summary, we have very compelling clinical data over 4 years of work in the clinic. We have a well understood regulatory pathway that we're executing on now, and we're beginning and are right on the cusp of commercialisation into Europe, into the US, and into Australia. So thank you very much.